Observatory of Social Development in Latin America and the Caribbean is one of ECLAC's regional knowledge tools. Its creation responds to a mandate of the second meeting of the Regional Conference on Social Development of Latin America and the Caribbean, when the member states requested that ECLAC establish an Observatory of Social Development to support the design and implementation of public policies and allow the monitoring of the trends. This way, the Observatory promotes the integral development of Latin America and the Caribbean,
Muy buenas tardes, muy buenos días a ambos hemisferios de nuestra región, de América Latina y el Caribe. Les queremos dar la más cordial bienvenida desde esta sede central de la CEPAL en Santiago de Chile. Saludo a Guido Camus, jefe de la Unidad de Información Pública de la CEPAL, y queremos darle, reitero, la más cordial bienvenida a la conferencia de prensa del lanzamiento del informe especial de la CEPAL, Repercusiones en América Latina y el Caribe de la guerra en Ucrania, cómo enfrentar esta nueva crisis, que en esta ocasión se realiza de manera híbrida, a través de, y queremos agradecerles mucho a quienes nos acompañan presencialmente, y también de manera virtual. Más de 56 medios están en estos momentos conectados por Zoom, y queremos agradecerles mucho también a los medios que ya están presentes en esta sede de la CEPAL. La plataforma Zoom está transmitiendo, por supuesto, en ambos idiomas este lanzamiento. También estamos transmitiendo desde live.cepal.org, desde nuestro canal de YouTube y a través del sitio web de la CEPAL, www.cepal.org, además de las redes sociales de la CEPAL en Twitter y en Facebook. Saludamos a todas las personas que nos acompañan en esta transmisión y en especial a los periodistas y representantes de la prensa que nos acompañan acá presencialmente y a los que se han registrado para participar en este lanzamiento vía remota, así como a los colegas de la CEPAL y del Sistema de Naciones Unidas que lo están siguiendo desde sus lugares de trabajo.
Colleagues at ECLAC and everyone that is following us, a warm welcome to everyone. And we have tried to shorten this fashion in which we work as a result of the impact of the COVID pandemic. The acting executive secretary of ECLAC, Mario Cimoli, will deliver the main conclusions of the report. And on this occasion, and especially, we would like to, he will be accompanied by Daniel Titelman, Director of the Economic Development Division of ECLAC, Rolando Campo, Director of the Statistical Division, Arenas, Director of the Social Division, and Jorge Janet Sanchez, Director of the Natural Resources Division. Following the presentation of the Executive Secretary, we will offer the floor for a Q&A session, and we remind accredited members of the press to send us your questions in writing using the chat for those connected via Zoom, or to the email conferencia de prensa at cepal.org. So without further ado, Mr. Mario Cimoli, Acting Executive Secretary, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gino. We thank all those present and those that are have connected virtually, and all those who accompany us physically in this room. The document that we will be sharing with you is a policy brief that follows along the lines of the policy briefs issued by ECLAC during complex situations. For example, the policy briefs devoted to the situation of COVID. We thought that we had finished, but we face a new stage with new impacts, with new processes, and with new shocks in terms of Latin America and the Caribbean, and we will continue along these lines, and we'll be presenting the impact of this and what is presently happening at a global level, and the repercussions of the war in Ukraine for the region. I would like to thank all the directors that are here with us, and the whole team that is also with us here today. This is collective work undertaken by the divisions of ECLAC, its officers, every single person working at ECLAC, and I would like to thank the publications, conferences, all the different areas of ECLAC. It's a great pleasure to be with you here today. Without further ado, I'll move on to the repercussions, onto the presentation. I would like to highlight some important aspects, how to face up to this new crisis. From the title, you can see that this is a new crisis, and therefore we realize that at a regional level, the region was already impacted by various powerful shocks. And what we would like to show as a first issue is the impact of first of all, we will have to have a look at the world outlook. It's very important to understand what is happening and to characterize what is happening at a global level. We want the region to be understood within the global context, and this is the first part of the presentation. For that purpose, our most important point is to clarify that ECLAC does not read this as a single unique shock, but looks at what is happening today as a process which is a different shock, and it is basically a cumulative process. I would like to be very clear on the fact that if you look at today, inflation is a problem which is faced by the region and also by a large part of the world, but the inflation is not the result simply of this war, but as an effect that was created before that. And if one looks at the value chains and looking at this is not something that happens now under these circumstances, but it's a process that dates back to the crisis in 2008 and 2009, and was also impacted heavily during the pandemic. And what ECLAC wants to say is that what is happening today is the result of a sequence of events which are cumulative. What is happening with value chains, inflation, impact on growth, and so on is the addition of different situations. And this is something that was cumulative. Today, it is very, very difficult to read the impacts of the war if we don't have that history of what happened before the 2008-2009 crisis, and even when major policies at a much more nationalistic level understood the competition between central countries and China, and the policies appeared industrial policies that were much more powerful to protect their own production. To read this as a sequence of events is important, but to read this in that cumulative fashion is far more important. All the phenomena, the impact on inflation, poverty, and so on, is a historical process, and this is the most important aspect that we must take into consideration. To read this independently would not be adequate. Many people talk about this. Many people talk about the end of globalization. Others talk of the reconfiguration of globalization. What clearly happens is that the region must view what is happening at a global level as a process that does away with the articulation that existed in the past and that represents it. And nobody could have imagined in the past that we were going to grow at a slow rate in both central and peripheral economies. Everyone thought that this slowdown will be momentaneous, temporary. But if we don't read what is happening now, we would be making analytical mistakes and we would not understand public policies adequately. Now, all entities and ECLAC have also pointed out that there is a generalized deterioration in expectations. There were some growth expectations at the level of the most developed economies, and they have all dropped their expectations. We have dropped that, and the trend is that there is a downward trend through by all entities, and that determines, and not only that one verifies the basic growth, but that the economy is adapted itself to slower growth, and therefore the expectation of agents, the behavior, and the behaviors play that role, and therefore by evidencing the deterioration of that expectations, that is important. It is clear with this case that we have here, the case of Russia is consistent, but in any country at a world level, the US, the Eurozone, the UK and China, in all those countries, expectations are lower. And maybe we can discuss this in greater depth during the Q&A session, because it seems at that moment will continue to exist, at least until year end. And we take this into consideration. This forms part of a cumulative process. And on the other hand, growth expectations are suffering a downward trend. And another aspect that we must take into consideration is the acceleration of inflation. Who could have told us that this issue was going to be such an important issue? This is not an issue that is simply managed or dealt with in Latin America. If you look at those figures, this is in all areas, and this is not a debate. This is a debate that this is not an exclusively Latin American debate. There is a debate in Europe in terms of how to deal with this. Economists blame this on demand, others put the blame on other aspects, but the debate on inflation is indeed an important debate. And therefore, the fact that we understand that this is a process that was created as from 2008 and 2009 implies a real economy that existed on a process that, as a result of the pandemic, led to an increase in prices. And even today, the measures that were taken and which were very necessary to take during the pandemic are all processes that explain, and we would have to understand how each one explains this situation. And this is an important issue because inflation, and this is, and we want to be, as ECLAC, very clear in terms of inflation. This is something that impacts poverty fundamentally. This is something that also has a fundamental impact on distribution. We want to be very clear on that. It's far more difficult to tackle inflation when you have low incomes and a strong informal sector than if the situation was different. The possibility of managing this is completely different and behaves in a different fashion, and therefore inflation is important, and we must deal with it and work with this. And this is an important debate.
I'd like to be clear about this, that it's different to have inflation in the central, where they have these powerful central banks. Then when we talk about our economies, our central banks have a role that's not marginal, but it's don't have the weight as other central banks have, such as the European central banks. When we talk about the measures that they need to take, we have to be very much aware of this fact and the different asymmetries of financing that make these variables extremely important. Within the context, it's cumulative and not just cumulative. We have low growth and expectations that are going down, and inflation. And when we look at the region, immediately what we see are these figures that we have here on the screen. And there's two things that we really must talk about. The first time, we have two very strong shocks. And as you can see, we have the shock that hit us throughout the crisis of 2008-2009, but then also the pandemic. And the truth is that in this case, and we have to say it very clearly and make it very obvious, the region, it wasn't like, I'm not going to say that it was blamed in the 80s for creating these processes. The truth is that we've had a lot to do. We absorbed these problems, and now we're doing the best we can to absorb these problems. This is very important when we talk about the history of Latin America, because we highlight all of these matters. So we see these two figures that we have here that are going really low. quite clearly these are two different shocks that the region has suffered. But what we're truly concerned about right now is that throughout 2014 and 15, it was a 0.3 growth, which is very little, very little. The region needs to grow a lot more, and we need to invest a lot more. And if we wait after when we got out of this, or what we had of 6.3 after the pandemic, and the tendency and the expectations for it to go down right now, we see that the expectation is not creating a climate of long-term growth, which is what we need. This is not helping us. This is sailing against the situation that we need. And we believe this is a matter that we should bear in mind and be very clear about it. So the response of the region is not that we're all the same, we're not heterogeneous. Every country is different and the situation of each country is distinct. And we must be very sincere and be very clear about this matter and say it quite sincerely. Sometimes we're looking at the various countries and this has an effect on the growth, and we see there are different types of reactions and situations that are very different. In this region, we see the events that are happening right now, such as increase of the price of oil and gas, affects some economies positively and others negatively. So this is heterogeneous with a tendency of one in some ways is very strong for it to go down as far as the estimates are concerned, and a process that distinguishes this region in a consistent way. Central America has also a relatively good growth, and there are other economies that's part of South America. We can see there are some growth rates that are consistent. In any case, the tendency and the global tendency and the region and the region's tendency is to go down as a weighted average. So basically, we're moving towards that world of going down. There is a very important response, and we have to see what is going to happen, because each of these economies is going to respond differently to inflation and growth. And this is very important to be clear about this. We cannot put everything in the same basket because not every country is the same. So one of the matters that we're already seeing right now, and I want to clarify this, is that often Latin America and the reaction of Latin America, as far as international trade is concerned, is one of the mechanisms that this process, there's a cumulative process of the structuralization of globalization, and is working from 2008 onwards, and that today affects and has been affected because of the pandemic, and we're still under the effects. We must be very clear that it affects the whole region. The economies that export hydrocarbons will actually have a slight increase, and there'll be other economies that will be strongly affected negatively with the prices of many other matters that they have to import and other things in Central America and the Caribbean. They're not the same. Some are very different, but generally speaking, this affects a whole part of the economies at a regional level. So we have to bear this in mind and be very clear about it, that even the economies that are a bit better, this also affects the distribution, internal distribution of the economies. This happens in many economies of the Southern Cone, especially in agricultural matters. So yes, the variation is very different, very heterogeneous. And if we look at this slide, we can see what is truly important to be able to have a proper, strong integration in this region, because in this model, the integration not only benefits those that have low figures here, but we also need to integrate the region so that the effects and the benefits will be distributed, and also the economies that are able, through exchange, be able to improve the whole region. That's a very important point. If you read that and you look at it clearly, it comes up and time again. Another point that's important, I'll repeat this, and it affects exporting economies as well with natural resources, has to do with inflation. Now, let me talk about inflation. We'll be talking quite a bit about inflation, at least as far as this conference is concerned. We'll be talking about inflation. It's not just born right now. The impact that we've seen throughout the pandemic was one of the main reasons for inflation. So we had a lot of shock of supplies, and then a breakdown on the value chains, and increase in prices because of shipping and among many other things. And then we had a real economy that wasn't really growing, and an expansion of liquidity that was very big in the central banks in the most developed economies. And that context explains, and you can see very clearly, the inflation that we have here. Very strong acceleration. And today, I'm sure it is a process that is active. And when you look at this slide, we would never have imagined that this would happen again And here, and then we see the proposal of ECLAC, we must understand very clearly that there are two ways to face this. It could be that some say, look, we can put policies and restrict the demand and see what we can do with fiscal policies and lower it and try and improve this and improve interest rates, because that's what other central economies are doing. Other types of reasoning that say, look, this inflation is a different kind of inflation. It's an inflation that has to do with the breakdown of the value chains and among many other matters. But if you want, we have these two visions that are extremes points of view. So ECLAC says that we have a very strong diagnosis that is explaining that inflation has a component that has to do with these two historical points of view, and we must also understand that. But on the other hand, we understand the efficiency of these instruments, but it's not very easy to determine what they're going to be. To balance these two things is not just a debate that we're having. It's a debate that's happening all over the world, in Europe, in the United States, and other countries as well. So the debate that we are in right now, if we understand it completely, well, I know that ECLAC has a whole niche of heterogeneous type of complementary types of policies that are complementary, but that's a different matter. But we'd like you to look at this and remember it, and then later we will have a debate. Now, another thing that's very interesting here has to do with unemployment. The unemployment rate is going up. It goes up quite a lot. And we can read this two ways. First of all, the product of employment or the employment rate reducing the employment rate, we could see this as something that is very positive. From the other hand, for a region to be developed, we would like to see the product go up and also employment go up at the same time, because when they grow up in this way, often the product grows a little bit more, but we have an economy that is developing with productivity and with employment, which is the real trigger of development. As we've said many times, an economy can grow with its when its employment dynamic grows. It can happen and continuously, and that's not happening to us. The result we have here is telling us that some part of the economy is growing, but other part of the economy of the country has a lot more informal employment. And we see that we have a lot of people who are working the informal employments, working informal. We like to see this curve working properly. This is not something that we can explain just because of the shocks that we have. We also explain it because we have a lack of policies that have to do with investments and many other things that I'm sure we'll talk about later. On this matter, the other matter that is very harsh on us and increases the gap has to do with the loss of the income of women. This is something, as you can see very clearly, the participation in unemployment increases. The gap is not closing. There was a moment when it seemed throughout 2015 and 2017 that this gap was closing, but once again, it has become much greater. And this is not resolving itself. And we see that men have a lot more unemployment than men, and it will affect these sections a lot more. We must bear this in mind because inflation really hits these areas, makes them much more marginal, much weaker in the situation. And the families that have just one parent and single mothers, it affects them even more. So the fact that inflation is something that has to do with poverty and the distribution is important to bear in mind. But also, let's see that everything that we wanted to improve before we had all of these problems, such as the role of women in employment and greater participation and improvement of salaries, affects women. And this is accumulating one thing on top of the other, because these are one of the most important conditions that we will see that will come out of this whole matter. And here, the data that we're talking about is one of the most interesting data, and that has to do with poverty. We are only considering the variables that we mentioned, but what we're really clear about is that we have inflation and growth rate. Our team, in this case of statistics, also monitors the social development and monitors this constantly and permits us to have this data, not on a day-to-day basis, but we're able to observe it closely. And only when we look at like 2% extra to inflation that every country has, we see that the figures are going to go up. But look at what happens when you look at the variable of poverty in 2018 to 2020. There was a moment just before 2018 that we thought this was becoming much stable, but now you can see it improved a little bit throughout the year 2020, 2019, 2020, but then once again, it starts to divide. So it went down between 33% and 32.1%, and the policies that we've had as well worked. But once again, we see that the incentives and the helps and these processes stop. Once again, we start to have this gap. And so this is something that concerns us a lot, because if you make a line between 2018 to 2022, you see it's almost 45 degrees, not quite, but it's actually quite serious. The whole matter of poverty, if it continues in this tendency, it's going to be really awful. And so in poverty, it's quite obvious. We see the figures. I think it's going to be almost about 8 million people more that are going to have food insecurity. Now, that's only bearing in mind inflation and growth. And if I add to this that it hurts women a lot stronger, and it hurts informal sectors a lot more, and they don't have any resources to improve social matters, we see that the impact of the situation can be even worse. And I want to bring this to light, because to have policies that are very restrictive can also hurt us a great deal. And this is a novelty. We're showing you the minimum varieties of most countries, but it's still interesting to see the tendencies. There are countries that are affected twice. We have inflation because it grows a lot, and on the other hand, they import a lot of natural resources. Another time, they also, at the same time, they import a lot of food. And this is why many of these rates that change from one country to the next, we have to bear them in mind in the situation of each and every country and the situation of poverty that each of these countries started with. What we're truly concerned with, which is a situation that is heterogeneous, that within a context of this type, and we have to be very clear, where quite probably, and because of everything that will be happening, the increase of what's happening in the United States, and also the currency rates in Europe and the United States, and our banks are going to increase as they have done. And my colleagues, I'm sure, will be talking about later what the banks have done. This will also hurt and hit each of these countries. So the monetary fiscal policy of most advanced countries hits us almost double. And that's a point that we must bear in mind, and we must bring it to light every time we talk about these matters. Therefore, let's be concerned about this. And this is not just hand in hand with the policies that we need to have in a long term. We need to have macroeconomic policies to make sure that this does not get totally out of hand. Otherwise, it will create a great deal of instability to the whole region. And here we have another matter. This is the first few data I want to show you. Who does this really affect, or who does it affect the greatest? Only bearing in mind the growth and the prices. And if we add to this the restriction on food, access to markets, is going to be even worse. So we must bear this in mind, that the whole process of what is happening and the impact on our population is going to be quite dramatic. And this is something that we're not used to seeing. And we're not just whitewashing this. We don't want to whitewash this matter at all. And in the same way that other people are concerned, we're also concerned. The difference is that others have stronger estimates and we have less estimates.
And I'm not blaming the region here, but rather I'm clearly saying that this system will be very complex. And here we have another issue, the inflation in terms of food prices. The region is an important producer of food. And once again, if one breaks down the issue of inflation and a low moderation of growth and the impact on poverty, the impact on prices, taking into consideration, this into consideration has a twofold impact, and therefore the issue of food security is a fundamental issue for us. And the issue of food security is important in the region because there are differences in countries. When one relates regional integration, what must reason this in the light of these aspects, just as we fell short when we faced the problem of COVID, and we also fell short when we did not have all of us the vaccines, and when we fell short because some countries had a vaccine and others did not, we cannot again be weaker when it comes to food security. We must intervene at a regional level, and this is clearly shown here. The region seemed that it was going to have strategic conditions, and one of the main agricultural regions is the one that is very poor in terms of the production of fertilizers. There are countries that talk about a strategic autonomy for us. This is very important, and we are running behind. We do not produce fertilizers, and we have to read this urgently, because this is what policies require, because this will have an impact on everything. And if you look at another extremely interesting issue that that we must debate in our region, this is a region that if we're separate, we lose, and if we're united, we win, and we win. But if you look at that, if you look at all countries together, and including fossil fuel exporters, we still face a tremendous deficit, and that is a very important issue, because the region increasingly requires the issue of investment in terms of food, in medicines, in fossil fuels, and in different types of policies. Now, we don't want to say that countries are operating individually around this, because this will be an issue that will be suffered individually by each country. So once again, the issue of fossil fuels is a fundamental aspect. If you add all this, we need a regional answer to this type of aspect. And another issue which has to do with this, the region produces exports but does not refine fossil fuels. And therefore, I ask myself, why is it that Europe can have a vision of strategic autonomy in productive and industrial and technological aspects, and why we don't have that debate? And that is an important, why we don't have that perspective. And this is an important debate. We need to enter into agreements, but we must have that policy in place. Otherwise, we will be strongly hit by all these aspects. And how can we then respond? Well, for us to be clear on this, up to now there are 4 issues of interest. In terms of macroeconomic policies, we must maintain pro-growth monetary and fiscal policies, especially with the structural conditions of poverty and a slowdown in growth. And we must use all instruments that are available, not only a single one. We understand that often we are restricted, but we must also have the possibility of using all instruments. And this is a debate that is present in many economies, not only in our region, and therefore we must rethink about this. Fiscal policy is absolutely central for development. Without a fiscal policy enabling us to stop the issue of poverty and better development processes to create more equality are absolutely fundamental. Fiscal policies that contribute to a productive structure to employment and so on. And we must also expand the fiscal space. We must strengthen revenues, and ECLAC is very clear on this. We must strengthen revenues, but we also feel that we must strengthen revenues and also strengthen investments. And when with regards to taxes to extra income of in terms of natural resources, that is very important, because many countries are stabilizing their rate of profit. And if the Central Bank of Europe can do that, we can also do that. Mario, we can say that here in ECLAC, and also as from the European Central Bank. So that policy for us requires a context, and we must rethink that in that fashion. And these are very concrete lines to uphold the welfare of the poor. And our director of the social division will probably talk about this, and likewise the director of the statistical division. We cannot restrict the international trade on food and fertilizers, and we must think what the region can do about this. We must maintain and increase subsidies on food. We must discuss that. We must agree to contain prices. We're not, and this is not something that we are promoting, but also is also being promoted in other parts of the world. We have always said this, and we would like to put this, bring this to the discussion. Agricultural and industrial policies. When everybody is thinking how to strengthen their productive system in Europe, they're thinking of the golden share. The issue of fertilizers and biofertilizers continues to be a pending task. And we have discussed this, and we'll continue to discuss this. And the promotion of fertilizer production is important, but not only fertilizers, but also other important products. Fertilizers is an example for today, but let us think about the future as well. Energy security, mechanisms to stabilize fuel prices, subsidies for more vulnerable sectors, and also to advance towards renewable sources and to energy integration. So it's not, we know that this region has natural resources and consistent natural resources. The issue of the energy transformation is not easy because the region has resources, but it also suffers complex poverty, a high level of informality. So it's not easy to do that. And therefore, transition processes at a regional level in Latin America and the Caribbean have been thought of considering the structural situation that we have. And therefore, we still need a dialogue with more advanced regions. And to summarize, Latin America faces new geopolitical scenarios. We cannot deny this. You can see that there is a geopolitical debate at a regional level. The way that this crisis has impacted us, but as we said, this is an addition of different types of processes. We must think of regional policies, and we must think of sovereignty and defense, energy, food, and key industrial sectors. So we must think of a regionalization. The question we ask ourselves is whether the region can respond on its own when the major regions will have 300 or 400 million people with policies strongly aimed at structural and technological change, and even looking at the future. Well, that is the type of policy that we need. We also need a strong articulation to respond to the crisis. And we must work hard on the issue related to the supply of energy and natural resources. That will be one of the main issues. And just to conclude the presentation, we believe that there is a set of policies that have to be maintained, and the region has to promote, and we must reason with an open mind with regards to this new context. But we do have to rethink some policies that we have to maintain are of a regional scale. I would like to thank you all, thank the whole team. We're, of course, open to answer any questions, and the new context poses a very important challenge to us. So thank you very much for listening to us and for being present in this event. Thank you very much, Mario Cimoli, Acting Executive Secretary, who has mentioned the main conclusions of this document, Repercussions in Latin America and the Caribbean of the war in Ukraine. How should the region face this new crisis? And now we would like to move on to the press conference as such, involving the media that is with us, both present here and virtually, and since we have this hybrid condition, I would like to ask whether in this room, whether there are any colleagues who would like to ask questions. If so, there are microphones available to ask questions. Let's see, could you pass the microphone to that colleague who is right at the back of the room, and then to the colleague who is sitting at the front, your name and whom you represent. I think we have a problem with the audio. Is the microphone on? Okay. Good morning, Amanda Santillan from Diario Financiero. My first question is, what are your growth projections and inflation projections for 2023 and 2024 for the region and for Chile? Thank you, Amanda. Executive Secretary. Daniel, please. Daniel is the Director of Economic Development. Thank you very much for your question. And we at ECLAC are still working for the 2023 projections. So normally those come out during the second half of this year. I would like to say that in general terms, what we have observed for the region and likewise for the Chile is that following a strong growth that we experienced last year, there is a strong slowdown in the whole region and also in Chile. And we are estimating a growth of 1.5% 0.5. We feel that for next year, there will be a downward trend in terms of growth, and therefore that means that the region will enter a phase of low growth, as mentioned by the acting executive secretary. That was already present before, and that implies a tremendous challenge in terms of inflation, as is evidenced by the expectation report of the central bank. For the case of Chile, there is a trend in the sense that inflation will very slowly take on a downward trend. And for next year, we would expect a lower inflation rate than this year, but we still have to see what that dynamic will be like. But in terms of the growth trajectory, we feel that there will be a downward trend. In other words, there will be lower growth next year than this year. And in terms of inflation, we are already observing a very slow change in the dynamics. And so next year, we should be evidencing lower rates. Thank you, Non Titelman, Director of Economic Development of ECLAC. And now we have a colleague in the front here. Good morning. I would also like to ask a question about inflation, because it is impacting both Chile and the world. How do you view inflation with regards to the next few months here in Chile and in the rest of South America? And along those lines, how can we face up to the issue faced both here in Chile and in other countries? Thank you very much, Norman. Executive Secretary, Daniel Titelman. Well, as I said, in terms of this year, inflation expectations are on the increase in accordance with the expectations survey, and we expect an inflation rate of close to 2 digits during the course of this year. The response in Chile in order to face up to the inflation have involved different measures. The government, through various programs to subsidize food baskets, have tried to mitigate the cost of inflation, especially on the more vulnerable sectors, and has also introduced fiscal policies which are much more focused on trying to attenuate the cost of both food and fuels. In the case of food, transfers to more vulnerable sectors, and in terms of fuels, we also increased MEPCO, which is the tool that the government has in order to mitigate fuel prices. On the other hand, the central bank has also applied sustained increases in the interest rate, beginning from 0.5 last year. And we now have a very significant increase in terms of interest rates. As mentioned by Mario Cimoli, our outlook on inflation is to understand that this is a very complex process, because it has a whole series of effects that were produced before the war in the Ukraine. Inflation increased as from May of last year. That's when it began to increase, and it reflects a whole series of supply issues. It has to do with the food prices, fuel prices, but also with shocks that came from before that. And therefore, we have an inflation on the one hand reflects the supply elements. In the case of Chile, there's also some demand components, given all the efforts and cash transfers made last year. But there is a strong mix in terms of supply and demand, and also within a very complex geopolitical component, because shocks in supply do not necessarily reflect economic relationships, but political decisions. The war between Russia and Ukraine has led to a significant increase in food and fuel prices, and therefore we believe that monetary policies should, as occurred during the pandemic, use all instruments available, and not only to rely on interest rates in order to prevent this, because there is a low rate of growth expected for the future, and therefore we believe that we would have to use international reserves that Chile has accumulated significantly in order to minimize or try to reduce the exchange rate devaluation, interest rates, and a whole combination of various measures in order to try to struggle against inflation and generate the smallest impact on the growth dynamic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peterman, and thank you for your question. Next, we're going to answer some of the questions that we have received virtually. The first one From Interpress Service from Italy, Orlando Milesi. He has a couple of questions, and the first one is, due to the growth of the price of fuel, we see there is a new opportunity for competitiveness of renewable energies, and we suggest the need of a better integration in the region with regards to energy matters. Could you talk about these two aspects in greater detail? Sir, you have the floor. Ma'am, you have the floor. Thank you for the question. Yes, in fact, the increase of fossil fuels creates an opportunity for alternative green renewable energies. However, it's not a simple thing. It's very important that the region should be able to come to agreements and coordinate to be able to manage the whole ecosystem that is needed for renewable energies, especially the alternative ones. It's important to look at the infrastructure. It's important to coordinate regulations. And in that way, to make sure that it's practical and pertinent for this to be developed properly, meaning, generally speaking, do we have possibilities? Yes, we have concrete possibilities, but we still need to take some important steps and firm steps to be able to achieve the proper coordination from a regulatory point of view, from the infrastructural point of view, and also agreements for development of technology that are necessary for this. With regards to the different country profiles, this will be a reality for those countries that import more than for those that are importing fuels. Thank you very much, Mrs. Sanchez, from the Division of Natural Resources from ECLAC. So there's another question that we got from press service, the same person. He says, so we see that the region cannot work in a fragmented manner because we need to be able to respond together to these global events. How could we move forward to be able to lower the social and economic impact of this crisis in each and every country? You have the floor. May I answer this question? Well, obviously, integration has a political component. But on the other hand, integration has an economic need. For example, it's quite obvious when we talked about vaccinations at the beginning of the pandemic. We saw that we had a very serious situation. I don't know if you remember, but it wasn't 20 years ago. It was almost yesterday. And at the same time, when it was solved differently. Everyone did it differently and did it by themselves. Now, that type of response requires the regional type of response that should be done in a much more efficient way to respond as a region. It has to be much more efficacious as well if we respond as a region, and that process of integration is very necessary. And we've seen this before, and talking about food is going to be very important. And the other matter of the transition of energies, as was said a minute ago by Janet Sanchez, is going to be a complicated matter because the region is not truly in a position compared to other countries. So integration in this region is a condition that we really need. Otherwise, each and every one of our economies will be left alone because we're all too small. We need to unite. So all of these processes, from the need that we have, like pharmaceutical things, etc., we need to be integrated to become much more efficient in a regional world. We need to be able to respond as a region. And it's necessary. I mean, I don't know if I've got any other word to use. It's necessary. It's not a condition enough, but it is necessary to be able to solve our problems. Thank you very much, Executive Secretary. And very quickly, let's read some of the other questions. On behalf of the Italian agency ANSA, Margarita says the following thing. Under greater inflation and an increase on poverty and interest rate, what does ECLAC, as far as measures are concerned, recommend for these sectors of extreme poverty? Executive Secretary, well, when ECLAC gives us the data of poverty, it seems that it just does like this. No, but it's a very complex thing. They don't just sort of measure the wind or something. No, look, no, poverty is like this and like that, and they guess it. No, they calculate it. They do it properly. So first of all, I'm going to give the floor to the Director of Statistics, and then after that to Alberto Arenas. But I would like you to know how this is done, because sometimes we don't always talk about all the monitoring that we have behind these figures. Thank you very much. Good morning to you all. Well, in fact, to be able to make an estimate of poverty, we use the information that comes from the home surveys from countries of Latin America, and we have a database that we call PAREOC, where we homogenize all of the information, and then we create these estimates of poverty with projections that we use. And for this policy brief, what we have done and the way it's been presented in the report throughout this years of 20 to 22, we have the information that we see about the growth of inflation, the growth of food products or lack of, and we're seeing how this has been, we've seen an increase of poverty and extreme poverty of almost 1%, 0.9 as far compared to 2021. So our growth is the growth of poverty is going to grow. It's also, and extreme poverty will also grow with regards to 2021 to about 14.5. Thank you, Rolando. Alberto, you have the floor. So what did we advise? What advice can we give? Good morning. Well, ECLAC has talked about that we should consolidate social protection, universal and comprehensive, sustainable. And in this context, we have to protect these levels for all of our population, especially those who live in poverty and extreme poverty. And within that context, we propose, first of all, to guarantee food safety, especially for children and adolescents. And it's of fundamental importance to keep and strengthen these programs for food at school dinners, which have been very important throughout the pandemic, as well as distribution of food that we already had throughout the pandemic. But it's also important to have these measures for social protection. The pandemic continues, especially those that are much more vulnerable, paying special attention to the sufficiency of these helps and to be able to protect the most vulnerable population, as it was said a minute ago. And then thirdly, to be able to face this crisis, and we've mentioned this before, it should also be an opportunity to be able to launch initiatives, to have decent work and to support small producers. And within that context, we should move forward with everything that has to do with formalizing work. Well, this is a very clear matter. And then the fourth point, the pandemic continues as far as health is concerned, and it's important to strengthen primary care and especially to invest in this public investment. And it's, with all that I've mentioned, it's important and basic that in order to move forward in this crisis with the transparency, it is essential to strengthen institutionality of social protection systems. If we want them to advance, to be more universal and more sustainable, we have to invest in the institutions. And this is very important to be able to face the potential increase in extreme poverty in this region. Thank you. I'd like to thank Alberto Arenas, who is working in ECLAC in social development. And there are two other questions I'd like to ask you as well. And the second question, actually, is in 2020, ECLAC was talking about direct help and talked about to break the little piggy bank as far as savings is concerned, of course. Now, with this increase of debt, what does it mean to use our reserves? I mean, to what extent can countries go, or how far can they go? And this was the same person who asked the question before. Daniel, please, you want to answer that? Thank you, Mario. Well, Thank you very much for the question and for the image of breaking the little piggy bank. It's a good image. Well, throughout the pandemic, the countries of Latin America and other countries of the world make a very big fiscal effort, which we thought was a good thing, to try to fight the economic effects as well as the social effects of the pandemic, and that was translated into things that we'd never seen before as far as facing a crisis is concerned. And also it increased our public debts and public deficit of almost 10% of the GDP, and now it's an average of about 53%. What I would say is that ECLAC, it's not that proposes that we should break our little piggy bank. What ECLAC says is that we should increase our savings to be able to help with fiscal policy, which is important to be able to move forwards to sustainable development. So in that sense, and understanding that macro restrictions that some countries live are much more difficult than when we started the pandemic, is how can we continue to have this fiscal development with the strategic point of view that will develop sustainable development within this context of safety. That's why we've made much more effort in increasing our savings and to increase public income through reducing evasion or tax evasion that we think is about 6.1% of the GDP for the region, where it's almost $325 billion, and how to improve many other things, such as restructuring what we call tributary expenses, which is to reduce taxes on certain activities and try to make them much more efficient, which is about 3.7% of GDP, how to increase direct income in countries that are very low when we compare them to the OECD of Latin America. It's about 1.3%, whereas in other places they're about 6 and 7%, if I'm not wrong. Therefore, there are a whole series of things that we can reform and changes that can improve public income to be able to sustain more expenditure and be able to move forwards to this inclusive and sustainable development. Now, as far as having more debt, we know that it's not easy, but we think that the region should not make the mistakes it made in the past of making very quick adjustments that will stop our growth, especially when we saw what was said before. And as far as the use of the reserves that we have, which is part of the question, many countries are using their international reserves to try to improve the volatility of exchange rates and to reduce devaluation, which is important because inflation is also there. And then on the other hand, countries have accumulated enough reserves so that they will be able to continue to use them. Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniel. Next, we'd like to listen to Carolina Puricet from Reuters. And the question is this: you say that financial conditions that are least favorable and we have high rates of monetary policies that could mean a flight of capital. So how can government stop this flight of capital and increase in rates? Well, the government's already trying to avoid this. Really, if you ask the question, I mean, they're trying to avoid this.
They realized this can have an impact. There was a positive impact at the beginning, but the problem with this is not so much the flow of capitals, but the lack of symmetry between both policies. A regional policy that reduces the impact on capital markets and must adhere to the movement and the movement of the monetary rates and of the exchange rates are central aspects. And in one way or another, that means that the impact of having to correct the inflation that we have at present is often exaggerated, because this is a very strong effect. But we have to prevent this, but we also have to act on this. And this is a very delicate issue, which is practically a trap. And therefore, we often understand that what is done in some cases in terms of capitals and Well, basically what I want to say is that this is a very delicate issue, and given the structural condition of the region, that is something that we must pay a lot of attention to, and we must very quickly intervene. But with this dimension, considering the dimension of this problem, it's very difficult to establish a proper behavior. As Daniel said, we must also take into consideration other reasons, such as inflation, for example, but we must also intervene in the situation and also understand that we are trapped by the situation. We often speak about global growth, and this is another interesting conclusion. The issue of development practically disappeared from this debate. We're talking of how the center of the world is doing or how the south is faring. In the past, we had the multilateralism and so on, but now we find one part of the world and nobody speaks about development. And when we speak about development, well, these are the issues that we have to discuss. When we discuss development, we must have the ability to discuss this seriously. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to face up to this. Thank you very much, Executive Secretary. And Clara Cepeda from newspaper La Jornada in Mexico asks the following question, and I would like to say, Executive Secretary, that there is a big appetite on the part of the Mexican press, and some of these questions repeat themselves, and therefore we will not answer each one of them, but I would like to mention that we have received questions from Excelsior, La Jornada, Millennium, Diario Financiero, and other Mexican newspapers. And I would like to mention that Clara Cepeda from La Jornada asks if inflation pressures are maintained, since we continue to see bottlenecks at a global level in terms of supply, the geopolitical conflict. What are the risks that you foresee for this situation to be maintained until next year? And supplementing that, a question which says, can we continue to make progress with our society whilst at the same time we fall behind in economic terms? Those are questions by Clara Cepeda from Mexican newspaper La Jornada. With regards to the second question, we could organize a whole seminar. That's a very interesting question, but I go to the first question. The situation that we have is a situation that has to do with what is happening with energy, with food. It's not that this is corrected and everything will go back to what it was before, because politicians and countries will have different policies. The more advanced economies will think about their own food security policies. Everybody will develop their own policies, and therefore the world must not be read as it was before. And therefore what the region must think about is to have a sub-regional policy that thinks about a strategy with regards to food and natural resources. I would like to offer the floor to Janet so that she can tell me how this how energy is impacting food at a global level. Well, for the region, and I would like to say that the impacts are heterogeneous in nature. For oil exporting countries, they have gained in relative terms, but not likewise in terms of the impact on poverty, because this is not automatically translated into an improvement in the quality of life of people. And for importing countries, obviously, they are very severely impacted, both in energy terms and also in terms of fertilizers. The pressure is the net import pressure of fertilizers. And there we find a very, very complex issue in terms of fertilizers. And in terms of food, despite the fact that we have a small surplus, still the region is heterogeneous, and the biggest vulnerability, both in energy terms and also in terms of food and fertilizers, is in the Caribbean and in Central America. So we must pay special attention to those regions. But but we can say that we have a surplus in terms of fossil fuels, or at least we are able to strike a balance, and we have a surplus in terms of cereals and grains. In theory, we should be able to have greater resilience if the intra-regional trade was activated in a much more proactive fashion. Thank you. Can a society continue to advance? Let's see. I would like to resort to a historical aspect of ECLAC. ECLAC always said that we were not only talking of growing, but growing with a change in the productive structure. ECLAC always said that the idea was to grow with a change in the productive structure, with a greater productivity, with more employment, with an increase in the labor mass, to have technological sectors in place. And if we advance, well, we believe that we believe that that happens when the structure changes. And what I am very pleased about is that when one looks at what other countries are doing, Europe today is making structural changes in their policies. The US is also making structural changes with its policies. And the question is, why don't we undertake those structural changes with our policies? And when ECLAC is then asked, why we fall back in economic terms? Well, one can grow in 5 sectors and still have the population living in poverty. The idea is to grow with structural change, and for that purpose, ECLAC says we must macroeconomic policies, industrial policies, and so on. And everybody looked at industrial policies, and today I invite you all to look at the policies in the industrial policy in Europe, in the US, or in other countries to realize, well, sometimes I'm a little bit sad then we have to face a crisis and a pandemic to realize that we were right. But if we fall back in economic terms, it's a concept that we don't understand, but growing with with structural changes, with proper policies, well, that we believe is what has to be done. And we need to strengthen what we're doing in terms of economic policy. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Now, we will Silvia Rodriguez from Milenio Mexico, Ivonne Martinez from La Razón Mexico. And I put those 2 questions together because they basically refer to the same concern. What is the level of Mexico in terms of poverty and extreme poverty? And what should Mexico do in terms of facing up to the conflicts in Eastern Europe? Executive Secretary Rolando Ocampo, Statistics Director. With regards to the first part of the question, I would like to say that with regards to the estimates that we have established for the increase of poverty and extreme poverty for this year, we believe that we are expecting an increase, a regional increase of poverty substantially in Colombia, Mexico, Paraguay, and Brazil. However, in countries such as Bolivia and Panama, we are expecting that poverty may even diminish somewhat. In terms of Mexico, I would like to say that our projections show an increase of 1.3 percentage points if the scenario is maintained as we expect. If there is an increase with the estimation of increasing the scenario by 2% compared to what we were expecting in March. And we're talking about inflation, and therefore we would be talking of an increase of 1.3 percentage points in terms of poverty. And that would mean a poverty increase of 1.6 million people who would become poor. And with an extreme scenario, we would be talking of nearly 2.5 million people who would fall into poverty. And with similar data to what is being presented in terms of poverty and extreme poverty. Thank you. Thank you, Rolando Campo, Director of the Statistical Division of ECLAC. Now we will try to answer the question asked by Ignacia Munita from a newspaper El Mercurio, who has the following questions with regards to the war in Ukraine. I would like to ask whether you're concerned with the fact that many producers of basic food are experiencing this type of food nationalism in the case of India, Malaysia, and Indonesia. This is a phenomenon that is this a phenomenon that is actually taking place, and what consequence can that have, especially for Latin America and especially for Chile? That is a question by Ignacia Munita from the newspaper El Mercurio of Chile. Well, this is a reality. Not only India, Malaysia, and Indonesia, but other countries are also considering this. In fact, they are analyzing their own energy and food securities within this very complex, specific situation. Russia has done this also, and other countries are also following suit, and therefore this is a real risk. Now, with regards, or as a region, as I've said, we have a surplus in terms of food, and especially in terms of grains and cereals. Less so when it comes to wheat and oils, especially sunflower oil. But if we were able to improve conditions of intra-regional trade, and if we consider food security of the region as a whole, we could improve the conditions of resilience in a region that benefits from the food situation. And therefore, we should not face this stress that we're dealing with now. And in the specific case of Chile, that does require this basic food, especially wheat. We have seen a tremendous increase of wheat. Well, that is a real concern that the government, the present government has already taken some decisions in order to at least contain prices. They have been involved with negotiations with the main distributors in order to try to contain prices, but that is a ghost that is still haunting us. Yet we face conditions, as Mario said, not as from each country doing its own thing, but when it comes to thinking of ourselves as a region, and with this possibility of having food and of being able to provide a quick response to intra-regional trade so that we can compensate and find speedy substitutes to other food, such as sunflower oil, for example, because we produce a lot of soy oil and soya oil and based on other sources. So that is what we have to do. But the ghost is present, and we are concerned with the reality which impacts importers primarily. Thank you. Now, we would like to answer the question by Francisca Bahamondes from CNN. And she asks, well, I ask about expectations for the situation in Chile with regards to growth and poverty, and the role played by the discussion around the new draft constitution.
You got the best question, didn't you? Very well, Francisca. Words too. The expectations of Chile. Daniel, the director of economic matters, I think you already answered this. With regards to, well, according to the figures of poverty and the figures of ECLAC, after an important increase in 2020, poverty in Chile went down appreciably. When we consider the emergency income, family income, and other transferences of monies that were given to the general population, at the beginning it was focused, and then after a while it was done universally. And then in 2022, we think that poverty is not going to increase a lot compared to 2021. What will happen beyond the figure as such is that we do believe that extreme poverty is going to continue to be higher than it used to be before the pandemic. And therefore, we believe, and in the whole debate that we have a very important challenge to face in Chile. And as far as the drafting of the new constitution in Chile is concerned, well, basically, this opens up space and to be able to face the challenges as far as social protection is concerned, poverty, inequality, and among other things, social rights, and put these social rights in the center of the debate. And therefore, in the center of the debate, within the center of the responsibilities of the state and of society as a whole. And we hope this will be an advancement with regards to social cohesion is concerned in our country. And there's a process that is up and running. I mean, our country is going to have, we're going to vote on the 4th of September, upcoming September the 4th. But basically, we see that there is a debate that is moving in a direction of putting the whole matter of the rights and the state in the center within the whole matter of social protection from ECLAC, from this house. We have also helped towards this. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alberto, who is from ECLAC and in charge of social development. So the last question, just because of time, it's not the last one, of course, but we've got many questions. But colleagues who have contacted us virtually in the next few minutes, we are going to be answering your questions in writing, the ones that we're not able to do right now because time is important in this press conference. Nevertheless, your questions will be answered in writing. So the last question that I'm going to ask the Executive Secretary to answer comes from our colleagues that have contacted us virtually. Ana Clara Pedotti from El Clarín, from an Argentinian newspaper. It says, how do you think this scenario impacts an economy such as Argentina that has a lot of inflation? And what do you think is going to happen moving forward? Well, for 2022, we're expecting a growth rate of about 3%. And there was an increase of investment that was also consistent. For 2022, we do not think that poverty will go up compared to 2021. So the figures we have are 8.3 for poverty and only 0.2% above for extreme poverty. So one of the main matters that we see here is that quite obviously the international price shocks, and if we add the price of raw material, it's going to have an important impact on the prices in Argentina, and it's going to create a lot of problems of access and affects poverty as well. So here we have an important matters to bear in mind, and that is Argentina has a whole series of social policies to maintain these things. And what is really important is to continue with investments. Investments have to be the short and long term that will help us have a basis for change. And we think this is extremely important. We think that at situations such as this, when we bring it to the light of what's happening right now, could be possible. And the stability that we have of these type of policies to increase employment and even the growth rate that was at 10 and 10.3 are indicators that we have to try to keep up and keep them stable so that they won't change. That's what we think is truly important. And then the combination of social policies that we've seen, those two processes, those two paths of keeping this investment up. And of course, the price shocks are going to be hitting us, but we have to keep our rudder or keep our direction stable for as far as these type of policies are concerned. Thank you very much, Executive Secretary. Before we close the cycle, I to ask our colleagues that are here in the room if they would like to ask one more question. And if that's not the case, then we will close this session. So I have received all of the questions, and I am committed to answer all of the questions that you have sent in. Unfortunately, time is of the essence, and we don't want to take up more of your time. So I will be answering this for you. So what I want to say to each of you, Raúl Castro from Fortuna, Mexico, and from Guatemala, and from Excelsior, Mexico, Leticia from El Financiero in Mexico, Paula Santibáñez from Valor Futuro, Chile, and from Dominican Republic, from Costa Rica as well. I mean, basically, those are the ones I have right now that are pending to be answered, and I will be answering your questions in writing that you have so kindly sent into us. Executive Secretary, we have concluded, therefore, this segment of questions and answers of this press conference of the launching of this document, Repercussions of Latin America and the Caribbean because of the Ukrainian war and how to face this new crisis. Now, just before we close, I'd like to offer you the floor if you want to say some closing words. Well, one of the things that we believe is important is that countries in the region should know that they have ECLAC that is with you, and we're thinking with you. And this new complex global situation, you have ECLAC on your side, and the whole system of the United Nations is on your side. And this is very important. It's our role as far as development is concerned because of our sensitivity and all of the things that we can do for you. So I think that's an important message, and I want to tell you that. And we are reasoning and doing our best. This wonderful team that we have, trying to reason on new ways, not just going back and doing what we've done before in the same tone that we did in the past. So I think this is very important that ECLAC thinks within this context. Now, the next thing is that what's coming is difficult. We are thinking about launching a new document together with FAO and other institutions that have to do with food security and poverty. And so we invite you to the next presentations. And last but not least, I must thank all of the team that are here, those who are right next to me, those who are on the other side of the screens, and absolutely everyone. Even yesterday, it was Sunday and everybody was working. And this could not have been a success unless all of our colleagues had worked together as a fantastic team. And the document, I'll show you if you can see it. It does exist. It's important you should see it does exist. And that you can read it, you can look at it. It has the figures, it has the data. So I would like you to look at it, revise it, review it, and criticize it if necessary. But I want you to know that ECLAC is going to be here, it's going to continue to reason in these terms so that all of our countries will be able to develop with change and structural change, with employment, with better access, more inclusion, and policies that are worthy of this region. So thank you very much, and we will meet again soon. Thank you very much, Executive Secretary. As he has said, all of the material associated to this launching of this conference are already available in the networks of ECLAC, and you can find them on the web page. You have the presentation, the document, and all of the other questions, as I said. If you want to send them in, of course, you can do them. And they'll all be on the public sites of ECLAC. So we want to thank all of those who have accompanied us, especially members of the press. And I want to thank you for the idea, the proposals, and the audiences of our region and the world. We want to thank you all, Executive Secretary, directors of ECLAC. Thank you again. We will meet soon. Goodbye.